What landed hardest was a comment from the CEO of Saudi Aramco, which is the world's largest oil company. And he said that even if the Strait of Hormuz opened today, the market will not normalize until 2027. If your surcharge model was built as a temporary response to a temporary disruption, it's time to convert it into a permanent part of your pricing structure. Hey everyone, I'm Shaun Hagen, CEO of CartonCloud, and welcome back to This Week in Logistics. So last week we talked about volatility being the new operating environment. We saw oil swing $18 in a single week. We had the major North American truck inspection event pulling thousands of vehicles off the road. And Amazon's supply chain services landed with the benchmark number got the whole industry talking. Well, this week the tone has shifted again. Dramatic swings have settled, and the headlines are a little bit quieter. But the thing is that when the dust settles, you get to see what the ground actually looks like and what's moved. And across this week's news from Australia, New Zealand, the US, and Canada, the ground has moved in some pretty significant ways. If I had to frame it in one sentence, it would be this: the dust is settling, but the ground has shifted underneath operators' planning assumptions. Three things happened that matter. First, the Hormuz oil crisis stopped being a short-term disruption and started looking like a structural reality that could last into 2027. Second, Australia's biggest freight infrastructure project just got scaled back, which changes long-term planning for East Coast operators. And third, this week's truck inspection data showed a clear gap between operators who were ready and operators who were not. So let's hit the news desk and get you caught up. Starting with oil in the Strait of Hormuz. Well, prices settled into a range this week. Brent crude was around $101 to $108 a barrel, which sounds like stability compared to last week's wild swings. But what landed hardest was a comment from the CEO of Saudi Aramco, which is the world's largest oil company. And he said that even if the Strait of Hormuz opened today, the market will not normalize until 2027. And the reason is practical. Mines have to be cleared from the waterway. Hundreds of ships that have been stranded in the Gulf need to be redeployed. And insurance companies need to actually feel confident enough to cover tanker voyages through the strait again. That does not happen in days or weeks. It happens in months. And we'll unpack what that means for your fuel planning in deep dive number one. In Australia, the federal government has stopped development of the northern sections of the Inland Rail project, which is the planned 1,600-kilometre freight rail corridor between Melbourne and Brisbane. Costs have exceeded $45 billion. The southern section from Beveridge near Melbourne to Parks in central New South Wales will still be built, targeting late 2027. Alongside that, the government announced $1.75 billion in investment into the existing freight rail network. We'll dig into what that means for your depot strategy and long-term planning in deep dive number two. Across the Tasman, New Zealand and Singapore signed something quite significant earlier this month: the world's first legally binding agreement to keep essential goods flowing between the two countries during a crisis. It covers food, fuel, medical equipment, and construction materials. Singapore's Prime Minister warned that energy flows through Hormuz may still be limited until the end of the year, and that's a signal that resilience is moving from a concept into actually enforceable policy. In the US, the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, known as the CVSA, ran its annual roads check inspection blitz last week. What that is a 72-hour period where inspectors across the US, Canada, and Mexico pull over and inspect commercial trucks. The day one data has come back and it was sobering. Roughly 1 in 3 trucks inspected on the first day was placed out of service. To put that into context, last year's full event rate was closer to 1 in 5. That's a pretty significant jump, and it happened in a market where truck availability was already at the lowest level in a decade. And we'll cover what that means for execution quality in deep dive number 3. And finally, on the Amazon front, the industry conversation around Amazon supply chain services has moved past the initial shock and into the practical question: what do operators actually do about it? Analysts are now drawing comparisons to AWS, the way Amazon built cloud infrastructure for itself and then opened it up to everyone. The assessment is settling into something like this: the stock market overreacted in the short term, but the structural shift is real in the longer term. Operators who can clearly articulate their own performance, their on-time rate, their onboarding speed, and their ability to handle complex freight will be fine. The ones who cannot will feel the pressure. Now, before we get into the deep dives, here's our logistics fun fact of the week. The Inland Rail project, the project in Australia that just got scaled back, was designed to carry trains up to 1.8 kilometres long. That is longer than 14 MCG football ovals laid end to end. Those trains were supposed to travel 1,600 kilometers from Melbourne to Brisbane in under 24 hours compared to the current 33 hours by rail. The plan was to take 200,000 trucks off the road every year. The southern section will still be built, but the full corridor is now on hold indefinitely. And sometimes the most important infrastructure fact is what doesn't get built. All right, let's get into the deep dives. Deep dive number one, the Hormuz crisis is becoming structural. Over the last few episodes, we tracked this crisis through several phases. The initial shock, the surcharge wave, the supply stress, government interventions, the military escalations, and now this week, what you might call the acceptance phase. The key shift is the timeline. When Saudi Aramco's CEO tells investors that normalization extends into 2027, he's not speculating. He's describing the physical logistics of reopening a waterway. You cannot just flip a switch. Mines need to be found and removed. Ships that have been sitting idle for months need to be inspected, crewed, and repositioned. Insurance companies need to rewrite risk models. Ports need to rebuild scheduling around changed arrival patterns. And here's what it means for you as an operator. If your surcharge model was built as a temporary response to a temporary disruption, it's time to convert it into a permanent part of your pricing structure. Not because things will never improve, they will eventually, but because eventually now means 2027, not next quarter. Last week, I said that every fuel surcharge model built on a single number is wrong. This week, I'd add, every fuel surcharge model built on a temporary assumption is also wrong. The operators doing this well are the ones who have flexible, two-directional pricing cadence. When fuel drops, they can respond, and when it climbs, they can recover. And they're not waiting for permission from the market to make that adjustment. Deep dive number two. Infrastructure assumptions just changed in Australia. The Inland Rail decision is one of those stories that matters far beyond rail operators, because Inland Rail was not just a transport project, it was a planning assumption. Over the last decade, a lot of thinking about where to put warehouses, which corridors to prioritize, how to balance road and rail, and what the East Coast freight network would look like in 2030 had some version of Inland Rail sitting in the background. When a project like that changes shape, and in this case, the northern half has been stopped, it forces you to revisit those assumptions. If you are planning intermodal strategies, regional depot locations, or customer contracts around a full Melbourne to Brisbane corridor, the practical question is, what still holds and what needs to change? The government has redirected investment into upgrading the existing rail network, track renewal, passing work, signalling. They've also launched a pilot program to incentivize shifting more freight onto rail and coastal shipping. So the commitment to rail is still there, just in a more targeted, commercially defensible form. The New Zealand-Singapore Essential Supplies Agreement is a different kind of infrastructure story, but it carries a similar lesson. Governments are increasingly treating supply chain as a strategic national capability, not background plumbing. For operators, that means expect more scrutiny around what your business can do during a disruption. Can you identify essential freight? Can you prioritize it? And can you prove what happened? Deep dive number three, execution quality is now the competitive differentiator. The Roadcheck data this week made something very visible. On the first day, roughly 1 in 3 trucks inspected was placed out of service. The carriers who passed cleanly were the disciplined ones. They had their electronic logging devices in order, their cargo securement correct, their documentation clean. The ones who did not pass are now dealing with delayed loads, compliance costs, and potentially damaged customer relationships. In a tight market, compliance is not just a regulatory requirement, it is availability. The truck that passes inspection is the truck that keeps operating. The one that does not is the one that lets a customer down. And this connects directly to the Amazon conversations. Amazon's 96.4% on-time delivery rate is not just a number. It's going to become the benchmark that customers use to evaluate every logistics provider. You don't need to match it, but you do need to know your own number, and you need to be able to explain where your service beats that benchmark, either in complexity, flexibility, responsiveness, or local knowledge. The gap between operators who know their performance data and operators who do not is becoming commercially dangerous, because in a market where the big players are publishing their numbers, customers will start asking why you cannot do the same. So what is the operator playbook for the next 7 days? Number one, convert temporary fuel responses into permanent pricing structure. If you're still treating your surcharge model as a short-term measure, update it. The Aramco timeline means 2027 before normalization. Build pricing that works across a range and adjusts in both directions. Number two, revisit your network assumptions. If you're an Australian operator, the Inland Rail decision changes East Coast planning. Ask yourself which depot, corridor, or modal assumptions were built around infrastructure that may no longer arrive on the timeline you expected. Even if we're not directly affected, the habit of pressure testing assumptions is what separates the best operators from the rest. Number three, make your performance visible. Know your on-time rate. Know your exception resolution time. Know your onboarding speed. Know your cost to serve by customer. In a market where Amazon is publishing its numbers and Roadcheck is publishing compliance data, The operators we can answer what is your number with confidence are the ones who will win customer conversations. If you watch this week, keep an eye on the full Roadcheck out of service results when they're released. Watch for any developments in the US-Iran negotiations. Brent will respond within hours to any breakthrough or breakdown. Monitor the Fair Work Commission's first review hearing for Australia's fortnightly fuel recovery order on May 25th. And watch how Amazon's supply chain services start showing up in procurement conversations and customer RFPs over the next few weeks. I'm Shaun Hagen. This has been This Week in Logistics. Spot the pattern early, simplify your response. And this week, the dust is settling, so make sure you know where the ground has moved. I'll see you all next week.